The journey of life is not always a straight line. It is a bumpy ride full of ups and downs, hills and valleys, twists and turns, joys and worries, days and nights, darkness and light. We all must fight to stay on the right path of life. Now, our greatest enemies are not as obvious as they seem. They silently infiltrate and go straight for the bloodstream. Attacking from within, their devastating effects are often extreme. Small and invisible to the naked eye, but deadly enough to cause the greatest man to die. Potent enough to put a pause on the livelihoods of every human life. Cruel enough to cripple the dreams of all people. Our microscopic enemies are lethal. Brutal enough to bring big businesses crumbling. Evil enough to eradicate entire economies to nothing. See, our enemies might be small and microscopic, but they have caused epidemics and pandemics of catastrophic statistics. Now, the strength of the human race is in its resilience. We always grow and learn from our experience. And thanks to the brilliance of science and research, the devastation of disease is no longer as much as we've seen, because now we have what we call vaccines. They say prevention is better than cure. Well, vaccines are helping us ensure that our small microscopic enemies are kept at bay. Now we can make the most out of a healthy day. Now we can properly chase poverty out of the way without the restrictions of a lockdown. You see, vaccines are the key for every king and queen to chase their crown. Vaccines are a shield that protect us until the war is won. See, when all is said and done, life is a journey full of ups and downs. And vaccines are the wings that can lift you up from the valley of the shadow of death and give you a proper shot at life by protecting your health.
Hello, hello. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, buenos días a todos. Good morning, everybody. Now, if you weren't feeling inspired and motivated before you watched that video, I'm sure you will be feeling now. Now, that poem was actually by Wakit256 from Uganda, and yesterday's was by absolutely a round of applause. Yes, thank you. And one more round of applause. Yesterday's was by an amazing young talent called Makida El Husseini from Ghana, and you saw them both here first. Another round of applause for her.
A very good morning. I'm sure that we can all agree it was absolutely gorgeous. There's so much energy, such a buzz. There's been some really incredible content here this week. The photo exhibition, the street artist, and a 360-degree experience. Please make sure to try it if you haven't already.
Absolutely, and we have such a packed agenda today. But first up, we'll be hearing a keynote address by Dr. Seth Berkley, who will present his unique take on how Gavi has, in his own words, been sailing while the ship was being built. And then we'll have a really important plenary discussion on how, at long last, the time is now right to eliminate cervical cancer. And next, we'll be welcoming the campaigner Shweta Narayan, who will give us a glimpse into how increasingly climate and health are becoming interlinked. And then we'll end this morning's session with a blockbuster high-level discussion where we'll hear from leaders on how they want the Alliance to adapt and protect future generations.
Maria, we are noticing quite a distinct shift in the program on this third day as we contemplate the present, but also look towards the future and what needs to happen next for the Alliance.
Absolutely.
Now, I don't know about you, Maria, but I want to remind you that yesterday in my sessions, we were able to announce 4 new donations to Gavi. I'm not sure if you had any.
I had 1 donation, but today we're going to top that, okay, my panel? We're going to
see what happens, and that's where I leave you for now. Good luck with the rest of your panel.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nzinga. We bid you hasta luego. Muchísimas gracias. And now we continue. And nobody, ladies and gentlemen, knows the Vaccine Alliance better than its leader. And to get the day started, Dr. Berkley will provide his unique take on the Alliance's journey, where it is today, and what perhaps the future may hold. And for that, it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome to the stage for the keynote address, Dr. Seth Berkley, CEO of Gavi. Please join me in welcoming him. Now, I just want to say a few words before I leave the stage. Now, Seth, you joined Gavi in 2011. You've had an enormous impact on the Alliance. And during your tenure, and I'm just going to give you 2 data points that may make you blush, but the Vaccine Alliance, ladies and gentlemen, has helped countries avert nearly 10 million deaths. Wow. And protect nearly 750 million children. That is incredible. Seth, over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and it's great to be here. And I think having that poet at the beginning, and my beloved, the scenes behind it were in Kampala and in Uganda, were very special to me, and I think young people capture what's happening, and these are the people that we vaccinated over these last 23 years. So let me start back at the beginning, and I know that the room has different levels of experience with Gavi, but what's the history? Where did we come from? And if you go back to the beginning of time in the immunization world in '74, there was less than 5% coverage in developing countries. The expanded program at immunization was done, and then an extraordinary leader, Jim Grant, led UNICEF to lift coverage up to what was called universal childhood immunization. They defined that as 80% coverage with 6 antigens. We didn't quite get there, but close enough to declare success, and then people let their eye off the ball and coverage went down. And so there was a new attempt to bring everybody together called the Children's Vaccine Initiative, and frankly that failed because the public sector wasn't comfortable with industry. And complicated story, but then the new experiment occurred, which was Gavi. And the launch of Gavi was really seen at that point as an experiment because it brought together not only core partners of UNICEF, WHO, the World Bank, and the Gates Foundation, but also brought industry to the table as full partners, both developed and developing countries, also brought, of course, civil society, implementing countries, et cetera. And so this experiment started then, and what you can see over time is a rise from 59% coverage to 81% coverage. We see a little decline there. We'll obviously talk about that. But on the bottom in green, you see also what happened. We went from 6 to 19 different infectious diseases that the Gavi vaccines presented again. And so this really was an extraordinary change that I would argue has changed the world of public health. You've already heard, we've discussed it many times, the number of children that have been immunized, about half of the world's population, and this has dramatically gone up over time. I think, the other thing to think about here is what this really means. We talked about the number of 6 billion completed vaccines, and thinking about what that means across the world has really been an extraordinary thing here, because I talked yesterday about 1/8 of humanities being vaccinated through the infant program, but if you add in the COVID program, other aspects, we don't know because there's going to be some overlap, but probably between something like 1/4 to 1/3 of the world has been touched by a Gavi vaccine. So this is really an extraordinary thing in terms of reach. But of course, we don't care so much about reach. Well, we do in terms of vaccine equity, but what we really care about is what are these vaccines doing? And this is, of course, perhaps the most important chart I will show you, which says that in terms of vaccine-preventable child deaths, we've seen a more than 70% reduction in those deaths over this period, and that has contributed to a more than 50% reduction in child mortality, which is the indicator that we use in development to talk about how countries are progressing. So the effects of all of you, of the Alliance, have really been extraordinary. Now, we, of course, have had a pandemic. I don't need to tell everybody here. And frankly, as we heard in the poem, vaccines were important before, but now I think the whole world understands the importance of vaccines. You see over here on the left of the slide the dramatic drop that occurred during the initial lockdowns, 30 to 40% drop. You saw that as 2020 progressed, we saw some recovery. So we thought, okay, that's going to now come up fairly quickly, but 2021 was a tough year for countries with lockdowns, with waves, went up and down. The good news is now in 2022, you can see this is administrative data. This is not the official WHO and UNICEF WUNIC data, but you can see that there is an increase over baseline. We estimate that that's approximately 3%, so we believe we're on our way to recovery, but it's a fragile recovery. And what's important is this does not talk about those children who have been missed during this period. And that's why we're having outbreaks, and that's why it's so critical to have the big catch-up now going forward. Of course, during this period, we also had to step up and try to make sure there was equity in COVID vaccines. We created, with our partners and new partners like CEPI, COVAX, and we've seen a pretty dramatic effect of that, close to 2 billion doses to 146 countries. When we talked about equity, we had the first dose going to developing countries in 39 days. Now, if you think about the previous pandemic of influenza, swine flu, vaccines didn't get to developing countries at all at the beginning. So we'd like it to be simultaneous, but this was good. Of course, we had all kinds of problems. I don't need to tell this audience that, of export bans, of vaccine nationalism. And that, of course, did slow down this process, but where we are today is 55% full coverage of lower-income countries with a completed primary series, and 82% coverage for healthcare workers, and 69% coverage for older adults. Of course, we believe those two numbers should be as close to 100% as possible, so there is still work to do, but I think we should be proud of the accomplishments that have made in health equity around COVAX. But as we think about the work that Gavi does, there's a set of levers we use to get impact. So you have the new vaccines I talked about, the resilient health systems, shaping the market, sustainability, and innovation. So I will take you through these briefly. In terms of new vaccines, we've seen a march over time. Now, as I said, 19 different infections through 50 different product presentations. This is why the complexity of the work has gotten much more difficult than it was at the beginning, with a small number of presentations and a small number of vaccines. In this list of vaccines are big blockbuster vaccines like diarrhea and pneumonia, the two largest killers of children that we were able to introduce and bring across the world, but also two cancer vaccines, hepatitis B and HPV, which we'll talk about later in this session. And of course, lots of vaccines that now protect us against outbreaks, against pandemics, and of course, COVID-19. And for the first time, we now have a malaria vaccine, a vaccine against a parasite. The previous vaccines have been against viruses and bacteria. So the vaccinology that has occurred during this period is really dramatic, and we'll come back to that later in the presentation. The other really proud thing that I've mentioned a few times, but I really want to emphasize is, we have rightfully pointed to the 5% drop in vaccines and talked about how tragic that is, how important it is to get coverage back up. But I know this world pretty well, and if you had said to me, okay, Seth, we're going to have a new disease that's going to shut the entire world down, we're going to have every country pivot to vaccinating the elderly and vaccinating people who are immunosuppressed and we're going to do this. And what do you think would happen to routine immunization coverage? I would have said, I don't know, maybe it dropped 50%, 60%, because it is a hard thing to do those two things at the same time. Of course, it did drop 5%, which, as I said, is a tragic thing. But what's really amazing is those health systems delivered over 3 billion doses of vaccines, 3 times the number they normally do, and 4.5 times the number as in 2015. So what's important is to remember, vaccines don't deliver themselves. We have built resilient health systems. Are they resilient enough? No. Do they cover the populations as well as they can? No. But we're on our pathway towards building systems that are there to not only do vaccination, both in peacetime and in pandemics, but also it is that woman health worker at that clinic that is going to be delivering other interventions. And so this is why the health systems part of Gavi's work is so, so important. Now, Gavi did a number of years ago have a new model. There's always been this idea of sharing the burden, of trying to make sure there's domestic resource mobilization. And this is our sustainability and co-financing model. On the left, you see small amounts for the poorest countries, 20 cents a dose, and they pay that for as long as they stay in that economic group. When they move through the low-income country threshold, which is now at 1,085 GNI, they move into a new period of variable duration. This can go for as long as it takes for the country to increase its GNI to above the eligibility threshold, which is now is $730. Those, by the way, change based on inflation numbers. And during that period, they increase 15% a year, their payments, and then they move into a period of accelerated transition. And it's important to understand the original model was 5 years for that period. But the new cohort of countries that are entering their accelerated transition had much lower GNIs, had many, many more vaccines. I've shown you the numbers, and therefore much higher financing requirements. And the board, in its wisdom, looked at this and said, we need to change the model. We need to extend that time of accelerated transition so countries have time to be able to take on the financing of this. And that has happened in this year, which is important to understand because some of our indicators are off track because of that decision. And I would argue that is the right decision. So it's important to keep that in mind. Of course, when those countries graduate, what is their greatest fear? We're now taking on the full cost of our vaccines and the health systems. What happens? What if those vaccine prices shot up? We wouldn't be able to do that. And again, working with our partners in industry, industry has stepped up and said, no, we will give countries time. We will keep those prices at the same level for a period of time. And that has really mattered to countries and has allowed the countries that have successfully transitioned, now 19 countries, to be able to continue to finance their vaccines. So these partnerships are really important. Of course, what we note, and I'll come back to this, is that the middle-income countries are not doing as well in vaccination as the low-income countries because they don't have this intense support network. And so there is a middle-income strategy the board has put together that allows us to work with middle-income countries and give them a hand up as well to try to make sure we get vaccines to everybody in the world that needs them. And you know, I would argue this mechanism has been incredibly successful. It's not perfect. It is painful, but the conversation between ministers of finance and ministers of health has led to hard-line vaccine budgets. And what we've seen is an increase in the total financing of vaccines because of the number of vaccines. But I'll call your attention to the dark arcs here. We've went from 8% covered by countries to 23% to 39%. And you know, we've had record funding, even in the pandemic, of co-financing from countries. And so this really, as countries have stepped up and have done what they've needed to do, their part of the bargain, to make sure that we can move this amazing agenda forward. Now, of course, if vaccines were incredibly expensive, even if they are valuable, many countries with low income couldn't afford them. And so one of the important things we've done is we've worked with vaccine manufacturers around the world to do what we call market shaping. And this diagram just gives you a sense in terms of size, but if you were to take these vaccines, and they're not exactly the same vaccines because different countries have different components in them, but if you tried to get as close as you could to a like-to-like comparison, the prices of the 11 vaccines that WHO recommends for every child in the world is around $1,300, and in Gavi countries, it's 24 to 28. Why is there a range? Because it depends on whether we're using 1 dose or 2 doses of HPV vaccines, and we'll hear about that later today. So I think this change over time has allowed countries to be able to afford it. And of course, this has benefit not just for Gavi countries, but it has benefits as manufacturers move to larger volumes. It has benefit for middle-income countries who can access vaccines at better price, which allows them to introduce as well. So how has this been done? Well, we started off with 5 suppliers from 5 countries of production when we started in Gavi, and that has gone to 19 manufacturers in 12 countries of production. Of course, as we looked in COVAX, we ended up with another 8 COVAX manufacturers with 13 sites of production. Of course, during this period, we also learned that despite having now a manufacturer that has been a pre-qualified manufacturer working with us in Africa for a long time, that Africa only is producing about 0.1% of the world's vaccines, and this had led us and the board to agree to a strategy to try to work on regional vaccine manufacturing for Africa for global health security reasons. And the critical aspect of that is to make sure that there is supply in the case of another emergency, but also to make sure this ecosystem that has delivered vaccines for the entire world doesn't get turned upside down, because of course we want to continue to provide vaccines of high quality at good prices for the world. So this is another new agenda that we're pursuing going forward. Now, innovation, and we had a good session on innovation early in the conference, is at the heart of the Gavi model, and I could give a 2 or 3 hour talk on the innovations over the last 23 years. You'll be happy to know I'm not going to do that. But the point would be is that when we talk about innovation, it isn't only about vaccines. It isn't only about the digital systems or logistics systems. It's the combinations of innovating in every specific area. You've seen big innovations. We've talked about it in cold chain, bringing new fridges, solar power, in immunization products. New patch technologies are coming, vaccine vial monitors, in digital and technical. We've had EVIN across India going to COVID and ultimately to UVIN, but many countries moving forward. We heard about MasterCard yesterday. The logistics, we've heard about Zipline, private sector engagement in logistics. And a big topic that people don't think a lot about is the innovative finance area, and there's been extraordinary progress there. We've brought in new partners, we've worked in different ways, and this has allowed us to respond in different ways, both during the pandemics, but in routine times, and to do some of that market-shaping work. So I think as we think about the tools we have, innovation really is a priority for what we do. Now, you had a session earlier on where we are on Gavi and the indicators. The 3 indicators that we are off on are, I'll start over here with the one in blue. This is the transition of 10 countries. The reason for this is that change from 5 to 8 years in accelerated transition, so a number of countries are just not going to make it in this time period. Of course, the economic effects of COVID is also affecting that. And so we don't know what that's going to mean for the next period, but it's a combination of those 2 things. And that also relates to the country co- and self-financing. Those numbers are a little lower because of the extended timelines and countries not graduating. We're actually making pretty good progress on that, and we'll come pretty close to the target that we put out. On vaccine price savings, there is some progress, but this period has been really focused on COVID vaccines. And again, industry worked with us, and Gavi had the lowest prices in all vaccines that ultimately we took to market. And that shows, again, the appreciation of the importance of price for countries that are at the lower end of the economic scale. So these are the 3 targets that we'll have to work hard on. Of course, the other targets aren't guaranteed. This is an interim report, and so we'll have to keep our eye on the prize going forward to what we promised the donors that are in this room, we would do as part of our investment case. Now, as part of the recovery, and I've talked already about the big catch-up, that's the first of our 4 must-wins. What were the purpose of these? We have a lot of things we're doing, and they have to go forward. We have lots of evaluations. We have engagement in international activities. But we said, what are the things we really want to bubble up and put at the top of the agenda? So the first is restoring routine immunization and reaching zero-dose children. This is the core of what we do, and it's going to be critical for outbreaks going forward. The second is revitalizing the HPV vaccine program. That's the vaccine that got hurt the most by the lockdowns because it's usually delivered in schools, and schools were shut around the world. Of course, this is the most impactful vaccine in our armamentarium. And so this is one that we really want to get up, and we have an ambitious goal of trying to get to 86 million girls by the end of 2025. Don't know if we'll get there, but we're trying to really drive that forward. The third is the malaria vaccine, which has been, for my African ministers, has been the vaccine that they say is most important to them, given the incredible burden of malaria in those countries. And this is not a magic bullet. It needs to be used in combination with residual spraying and with bed nets. But what's different about this is vaccines have the highest reach of any product. So if we can get vaccines to those that can't get access for the other tools, we can have a substantial effect. And the estimated effect is for every 200 children you vaccinate, you save 1 life, which makes it, even though it's not a perfectly efficacious vaccine, a very powerful vaccine. A long time coming, 30 years of investment by GSK and other investors in getting this over the line. The good news is there are a lot of other vaccines following that, and that's going to be important. Finally, the COVID vaccine program was critical. It was critical for equity. It was critical as a world problem. You've already heard we saved 2.7 million lives with that program, but also it was disruptive. And so the challenge now is to help countries reintegrate that into their routine system, and also for Gavi to reintegrate it into our systems, because we had to adapt and adjust internally to have this scale up. We're very proud of the fact that Gavi had, before the pandemic, a 2.47% overhead rate. I think that's something our donors can be proud of. I would argue perhaps we were too lean, but in hiring up, we just didn't have the surge capacity. We didn't have the people, so we had to hire temporary people. We had to create temporary mechanisms, bring in a specialist across the entire field, and now integrating that, deciding what stays and doesn't, is a critical part of what we're trying to do this year. Now, I mentioned zero-dose children. You've all heard the concept. I think, for me, this is a really important indicator. If you look over time, starting when Gavi started, there were 18.6 million zero-dose children at that point. Zero dose is defined as not having a single dose of routine vaccine. They may have gotten a polio drop, but routine vaccine. And what you've seen over time is we've successfully dropped that in half into Gavi 4.0. But during the pandemic, the funny thing happened, which is people didn't, most of them didn't drop from having, a DPT-3 to DPT-2 or DPT-1. They just didn't get vaccinated. They became zero dose again. So these are children that are living in families on the margins of delivery. And so we really have to bring these up. And why is it so important? Because 2/3 of these zero-dose children live below the poverty line, so it's a good indicator of poverty. And 50% of children that are dying in these communities. So this is a great indicator. We've worked with our development partners to begin to use this indicator as an indicator for other parts of development, because this would be a good way to be pro-poor, pro-women, and obviously pro-outcome. And so we've had great success working with the World Bank and other groups to try to think about this as a DLI and other activities going forward. This is one of the most dramatic graphs I can show you. So through history, women died in childbirth. This has been, from the beginning of time, that was the bane of women's existence, dying in childhood. And had we had a vaccine to protect women against dying in childbirth, of course, we would have wanted to roll it out. And you see here in 1990, there were 532,000 maternal deaths. The good news is maternal deaths have been coming down. The bad news is cervical cancer deaths have been going up. And so we don't still have a vaccine against maternal deaths, but we do have a vaccine against cervical cancer. And so this is why this vaccine is so important to get out, because these are tragic, horrible deaths, women dying in the height of their lives, young women, mothers, partners, this is a slow, painful death if you get it in a state that is late in the course of disease. So this is a real priority for us going forward. Changing in Gavi is also the sense of where we are on outbreaks. We've got a world that has a big increase in human-animal interface, in migration, in climate, in conflict, urbanization. The numbers, as you know, 8 billion going to presumably around 10 billion. We are going to see more outbreaks. It's evolutionarily certain we're going to see them. You can see on the bottom of this chart that over the last 5 years, we've seen increasing calls for vaccines to protect against outbreaks, this year at record levels in 22, and already in the beginning of 23, many more calls on this. This chart lists some of those outbreaks that are going on. So we need the system to be more resilient. We need the stockpiles to be more prepared. We need industry to make sure we have resilient access to vaccines. And so this is an important priority for us going forward. Here's an example, cholera. Cholera started, early on. There was, very few vaccines, difficult to use. And only in the recent generation of vaccines have we begun to see something very interesting, which is countries in the past didn't say they had cholera. They said we have acute watery diarrhea. So what happened all of a sudden is now there is an intervention. The real intervention for cholera, by the way, is not vaccines. It's having clean water and having good sanitation. But of course, you can't just leapfrog into having perfect water and sanitation. So when countries knew that there was a vaccine that worked, they began to say, we need that vaccine. And of course, with climate change, with flooding, with drought, we've seen more and more outbreaks. And you can see what's happened to the demand for this. Now, what's interesting is Gavi has two programs. We have an outbreak program, which is in orange here, but we also have a program to work on trying to reduce cholera in the hotspots. We're in the 7th global pandemic of cholera right now. It's not under control. There are still hotspots. That's why it keeps popping up. But it is possible to conceive of a world where you can vaccinate and control cholera in those hotspots and therefore dramatically reduce the risk of cholera in the world. So this is something that is also on the agenda going forward. And I'd say that if we think about the work on pandemic preparedness, if you look at the core amount of expenditures and you track what it is that we're doing that help countries prepare, including providing outbreak vaccines and building these resilient health systems, delivery systems, we spent about $6.5 billion in 2016 to 2022, but of course with COVAX, another $12.5 billion. So this has become a really important part of what we do, and I suspect will be even a more important part in the future. Now, COVAX was a very difficult time for all of us, and I just want to go through some quick lessons of what we learned. First of all, to do this well, the best way to do this is to use a network of partners that are already there, that have the footprint, and that can make a difference. So we didn't set up a complete new governance mechanism, new institution. What we did is we brought together, as the alliance you would expect, core alliance partners, but also bringing CEPI, for example, that was not a core alliance partner, into the family. So a network systemic approach. One thing we learned is we didn't have money at the beginning. Donors were very generous. They let us use some of the money from the pneumococcal APC, but we need contingent financing, day zero financing. We need to have surge capacity. I've already talked about the human components and being able to move quickly in doing that. We also learned that others who said they were going to fund delivery, there was a lot of money during COVID, but Gavi works best when we bundle financing for delivery at the same time we provide vaccines. We didn't do that at the beginning of COVAX, and we learned that lesson. The ability to take risks. Our board had to go through and adjust the way it works because risk-taking is critical in a pandemic. The donors agreed we could take risks. This was very, very important conversation. We had it but very rapidly, and it would have been better if we had those conversations before, the issue of manufacturer transparency. The manufacturers worked, they supplied, they increased from no doses up to 11 plus billion doses in 2021. No one thought that was possible. But the one thing we didn't know was when a manufacturer came to us and said, we can't deliver, and there were real problems we knew about, was that only they can't deliver to COVAX and they're giving it to other of their customers, or was this really the fact that they couldn't deliver at all? So having transparency on who's getting what and how that's moving is really important. And then finally, I've already mentioned the diversified vaccine manufacturing, because in a world of vaccine nationalism, in the routine times, the system, the ecosystem works pretty well, but in a time of vaccine nationalism, it doesn't work well, and making sure the world is protected. I mentioned middle-income countries. Why doing it? The 63% of eligible middle-income countries lag in critical vaccine introductions. Their poorest and most vulnerable are left behind, and they also are backsliding. So this is important as a way, when we talk about leaving no one behind, to be thinking about this. The board has put a little over $300 million into this, working with 45 eligible countries. So looking ahead, what are 4 areas that I think might be worth focusing on: global health security, universal health coverage, reducing neonatal mortality, and spurring a new renaissance in vaccines. On the global health security side, the world is just changing dramatically. We know that. Climate change is a real thing. It is going to have an effect. It's going to have an effect on storms, on climate emergencies, but also on vectors. We're going to see soon vectors that are not seen in wealthy countries, all of a sudden coming up with the diseases with them. We're going to see broadening in developing countries of these vectors. That is going to lead to many, many problems and more polycrises, which are affected by all these other things on here. So this is something we have to be prepared for. I mentioned about immunization reaching more households. This is the looking at immunization as an intervention. It's the graph I showed you at the beginning. And you see all these others, and you say, oh, it looks like there are some other things that are also reaching larger populations. But we have to remember that immunization is gender neutral. So we're talking about reaching all infants. And if you look at many of the other interventions, whether it be treating people with HIV, obviously you have to be HIV infected to be treated, or looking at bed nets, that has to be in malaria areas, or stilled attendance at birth. This is obviously women delivering. So I think that the point would be is that this is the intervention that reaches the most, and that's why it's so important as a way to get to those zero-dose communities and put those health workers in there. As we've seen that drop in under 5 mortality rate over time, and this is the most important indicator we have, below this is the drop in neonatal mortality. And as you can see, the slope of that line is much lower than is the slide for the under 5 mortality rate. We have 2 new vaccines that could have an effect here, RSV and Group B strep. Obviously, we have to wait to see what those vaccines are, the efficacy of them, and what effect they will have. But this is another area that could continue this drive down of getting rid of preventable child mortality, and is important for the future. And finally, you know, I'm a vaccinologist, I'm biased, but I will say that the renaissance in vaccines that occurred during COVID is extraordinary. There are hundreds and hundreds of new vaccines being tried. As I think about my future directions and as I talk to colleagues in the industry, it's incredible how many new technologies are being tried. They won't all work, but I believe in the power of science. So we're going to see important new vaccines: dengue, RSV, chikungunya, Group B strep, Shigella, tuberculosis. Of course, I believe HIV will ultimately happen someday, and I was hoping it would happen in my tenure at Gavi. It didn't, but other cancer vaccines are coming, chronic disease vaccines. Prevention, as you heard in the poem, is better than cure, and so we're going to have amazing new tools that can help keep people healthy, keep the costs down, and to do that, we're going to need these systems. We're going to need a very, very strong Gavi going forward. So With that, I thank you for your attention, and I hope you've seen a little bit of what we've done up until now, where we can go in the future with all of us working together. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Really fantastic to hear from Seth. I'm just in my journalist brain at the moment, just thinking, wow, what exciting work the Alliance has done. And I love that, what Seth said there, about looking forward to the renaissance of vaccines that took place during the pandemic, possibly one there for neonatal mortality, the malaria vaccine, cervical cancer vaccine. These are topics that, as an international news anchor, we cover the world and we talk about every single day. So good luck, everybody, with your work in the future. And again, amazing the work that you have all done to date. All right, thank you so much also, Seth, for really showing us that thread of how Gavi's evolution has helped adapt and react to so many new challenges over the years. And now it is time for a quick short video of the highlights from yesterday before we take a quick break. Here's the video. Oh, fantastic. What a magical evening we had. I'm still feeling that magic from yesterday from the Teatro Real here in Madrid. Ladies and gentlemen, see you very soon in 15 minutes. Hasta luego. Muchísimas gracias. Nos vemos en 15 minutos. Adiós. Hasta luego. Bye bye. Thank you.